Thank you so much. Thanks, John. Also from my side, welcome everyone. I'm delighted that we are launching this webinar series here. I'm Annette. I'm the director of the Global Security Program, which is a research program at Oxford's Pembroke College. And in our research program, we work on security at the intersection of armed conflict and illicit economies. We also look at responses to insecurity and links between localized insecurity and global order. This webinar series is part of one of our ongoing research projects, and that project is called Contested Cross-Border Spaces, Illicit Flows, and Order in the Contemporary World. And so this project, as you can hear already, has the same name also of our webinar series. Now, our work is supported by the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program funded by UK International Development. And we are very grateful for the support that we are receiving from them to be able to host the seminar. Now, our project explores how borderlands shape conflict, livelihoods, and global security, and why understanding these spaces is essential for policy and practice. So let me just say a few words about the project before we dive into our discussion. So first of all, why does that matter? Well, many of today's security challenges do not respect state borders. Illicit flows of weapons, of drugs, money, and people, they move through contested cross-border spaces. And these flows are not purely harmful. They often actually intertwine with illicit and informal economies that sustain livelihoods and local stability. So that's why borderlands are not ungoverned spaces. They are areas where governance is negotiated among state actors, armed groups, communities, and economic brokers. So as a core questions, we are asking, first of all, how do governance dynamics in contested borderlands enable licit, illicit, and informal flows? And then secondly, how do these flows influence conflict, regional stability or instability, and global order? And we do that through a global perspective. So we link local lived experiences in borderlands to regional dynamics and globally networked supply chains, especially illicit supply chains. And by doing so, we hope to challenge state-centric views of security by showing how overlapping authorities and hybrid governance systems shape everyday life and transnational networks. We do that by combining different types of methods. We use fieldwork, spatial network analysis, new data sets, complexity science. And the idea is to capture dynamics that are normally invisible to policymakers. And just to add that, in addition to the more traditional research outputs like papers or books, we produce, for example, also interactive digital visualizations. Some of them are actually already on our Global Security Program website. Now, we do believe that our work should have not only academic relevance, but also matter for policy and practice. And that's partly because the findings, they help identify when trading centers, for example, become trafficking hubs, or how governance arrangements strengthen or disrupt illicit networks, or where interventions can improve livelihoods while reducing conflict risks. So overall, the project really aims to inform conflict-sensitive programming, stabilization efforts, and cross-border policy design in addition to having kind of the scholarly contribution. Now, with regard to the webinar series, the idea here really is to, first of all, share emerging findings from our own work, but we also hope that we can connect researchers, practitioners, and policymakers and really validate different types of insights through dialogue by hearing from other researchers, partly also from the wider ACCEPT program, but also beyond that, and kind of build sustained networks across regions and disciplines. So we have these 6 sessions. Today is the first one. We have next week another one, and then 1 week later. Then we have a short break, the Easter break, and then resume in April with a further 3 sessions. So please definitely after the session also stay tuned for more from our end. And with this, I'll hand over to John, who's going to moderate today's session and will say a bit more about the focus of today as well.
Thank you very much for this great introduction, Annette. Yes, so my name is John Helfrich. I'm a researcher here at the Global Security Program and a lecturer at Hartford College. I will just briefly introduce today's topic and speakers, and then we'll head straight into our discussion. Note that there will be a 15 to 20-minute Q&A at the end, so feel free to post your questions in the chat, and I will raise them later with the speakers. Also, our speakers will provide reading suggestions at the end of the seminar on today's topic, so stay tuned, and we'll make these suggestions available later in a list that compiles sort of all the readings and suggestions, podcasts, etc. on the webinar topics. With that said, let me introduce today's topic. Today, we want to explore how and why borderlands matter for global security and political order. So, for instance, our speakers will analyze how local arrangements involving state actors, armed groups, and civilian communities intersect with regional instability and wider geopolitical dynamics. In doing so, the discussion tries to, as Annette already mentioned, go beyond the typical state-centric approach to international security. So let me briefly introduce our speakers today. We are very glad to have with us Daniel Agbiboa. He is an associate professor of African and American studies at Harvard University. Daniel's research focuses on the intersection of violence and order, urban governance, empire, and African subjectivity. So we are glad to have him explore especially borderlands and order making in West African contexts with us. And now we're very glad to also have Brian Wong with us. Brian is an assistant professor in philosophy at Hong Kong University. He's a political theorist by training, but interested in geopolitical dynamics. His research examines authoritarian regimes, historical injustices, and the interaction between domestic politics and foreign policy of states, especially in East Asia. Brian was a Rhodes Scholar here at Oxford, and he's the founder of the Oxford Political Review. And last but not least, our very own Annette Idler, who is the founding director of the Global Security Program and an associate professor at the Blavatnik School here in Oxford. So with that, let me just jump straight in with our first question. And so when we think of borderlands as a fragment, so many describe today's moment as a moment of fragmentation and disorder. So Brian, to you, how does this look from your perspective? Should we think of today's historical moment as one of fragmentation and disorder?
Well, thank you very much. And I must once again apologize for arriving slightly late. It's a real privilege to be able to join you, Daniel, and of course, Annette on this conversation. What an august crowd and audience to be amongst. If I may, I'd like to make two observations. And the first is that the historical default for the international order could well be one of multipolarity. And therefore, the talk of the world as comprising a multitude of poles is nothing new and is really nothing rather surprising. And I can elaborate on that shortly. But the second observation then is when it comes to fragmentation and fracturing, what we really need to ask ourselves here is what is the sort of level of fine graining and definition that we're working with here when it comes to order and disorder, right? For one man's disorder could merely be another's rejuvenation and also evolution as well. So on the first point, very quickly, we hear this adage and assertion that the world is multipolar, or it's bipolar, or unipolar, or it's becoming more multipolar. And one core emphasis point that I really want to highlight here is that the fact that the world is becoming more decentralized does not therefore make it, as of now or as of an imminent future, therefore multipolar. We are still operating today in a largely US-led unipolar world where financial hegemony is a US, where multilateral institutions, despite the shirking of responsibilities on the part of Washington, remains heavily US influenced and shaped, where global supply chains, despite this sort of apparently promising rise and surge of manufacturing prowess on the part of China, ultimately 60 to 70% of the end markets for goods that are being rewired today are still directed towards countries in the global north. So the argument that the world is trending towards more fragmentation, is inevitably true. It's almost truistic. But to say that that therefore implies we live in an era where there's no order, no pole, and no dominant power, I think it's questionable. And secondly, just very quickly on the levels of definition, perhaps on an international level, we are indeed seeing the rise of emergent middle powers that are willing to flaunt, to defy and challenge established norms and conventions as they exist. But that does not therefore imply, again, on an overarching macro and global level, any of these powers on their own would be able to challenge and thwart the sort of hegemony that we've observed since the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, even though on a microscopic level, in the hearts and minds of people like you and I and folks on the ground, our minds are changing. And I would say our minds are leading the collective minds of our societies, which in turn could hopefully spearhead and trigger chain reactions and eventually influence political institutions and also opportunity structures down the line. But by and large, a recognition that a world is more than just a single dominant order dictated by those who held the keys to determining and defining the terms of what's right and wrong, that awakening's begun. But for that awakening to percolate through and really materialize as changes in a distribution of material and also, dare I say, the superstructural powers in the world, that's going to take a while, and indeed longer than what many folks might hope for, given or judging from the commentaries today. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was super interesting, this sort of macro big picture analysis. And there's a lot to unpack there about the role of the US and so on, which we'll hopefully do in the next 45 minutes. But before that, maybe we move to sort of the meso or micro level. And I would like to ask you, Daniel, how do you see fragmentation reflected in the borderlands that you study, or if you even see fragmentation reflected?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up from the second part, the sort of the skepticism you introduced. After all, I come from the everyday, so skepticism is bread and butter for us. First, thank you for having me, and thanks to, I think I see some members from the Accept team who generously funded it and made it possible. Let me pick up from what Brian was saying and maybe give it some temporal time sort of dimension. When you pose the question to Ross, you posed it from the angle of a moment. And Brian is sort of introducing some sort of messiness into that sort of neat linear time that is put forward before us. And it's within that sort of messiness that my work unfolds, really, where people are talking about what we call fragmentation and disorder as being, you can call it the long moment. It's the everyday, it's the lived reality for them. And so in that sense, then, if you call it the moment in a global order, then there's a certain kind of dramatization of that moment, a certain kind of spectacularity that follows, a certain kind of affective response that should follow. For example, when you say there's a global moment of fragmentation, that could either lead to humanitarian aid being cut and all of a sudden we are in some kind of panic mode, right? And we kind of then, we superimpose that kind of projected fragmentation onto the everyday. But what I argue is that the everyday is not characterized by moment. It's lived. It's a time that is cyclical. It's not a teleological time that is progressing towards something. So in that sense, then, what happens? How do we understand the agency of the everyday? Because if you think about it from the moment, you think about intervention as something that comes from the external, and whose very interruption now creates crisis at the everyday. But if you think about it, if you reverse time and look at it from the cyclical aspect, then you begin to see what I call promiscuous agency, the agency of people on the ground, which is always open. Okay, aid might come from the US and we will benefit from it while it lasts. While it lasts. It's not ad infinitum, right? It's not till forever. So you keep your options open. This is what Borderlands know. They know it so well because the spaces that they occupy is itself very fluid, as Annette herself knows very well from her study. Identities themselves are fluid, language is fluid, so the geography maps into the strategy of navigating that particular space, which means that while at the global level, we're talking about panic and order changing, at the everyday level, we have to learn from the ways in which people structured their life based on fluid geographies and fluid agency. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that they're not waiting for some UN to come and save them in times of conflict. They can create hybrid security governance, which we can talk about later on, that exchange information and pool money together to survive in difficult times. And just recently, in the research I've been doing, I came across a language from the everyday called soldiering. And I said, what is the meaning of soldiering? Soldiering is just returnees that are coming from these borderlands, from Boko Haram insurgency, who are looking to reintegrate into society, who decide in a creative way that they're going to get this commercial tricycle, what you call the rickshaw in some parts of the world, and they're going to share it among themselves, recognizing that it cannot go around everybody and everybody needs livelihood. So I would work from morning to a certain time and I'll pass it on to somebody else who works from a certain time. So they call it a soldiering, which is sort of a language of hustling. So it's just to give you an idea of the different kind of temporal order that we occupy and the ways in which the geography of borderlands itself map into the strategy that is used. And perhaps, maybe if we're humble enough, we might open our eyes to learn from them.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this super important lens that sort of motivates us to also sort of question some of the teleological assumptions that are built in today's ways that we talk about this historical moment, and to also sometimes shift the perspective perhaps and reverse the gaze. And I think we'll do that more later. For now, maybe Annette, if you could come in and share your thoughts on how you make sense of this sort of global moment, particularly through the lens of global security.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Well, first of all, I think I agree that it's really difficult to talk about a moment, right? It's more maybe something that has been in motion for a long time and that is changing slowly over time. I mean, if we want to try and bring kind of the global and the local together, which is what I'm doing in my work as well, then if we look at Borderlands, I would argue we can use them as some sort of magnifying glass on what's happening in society more broadly. That's how I call it in my first book. So what I mean by that is that in Borderlands, we've long been seeing how there's a constant, like going back to what Daniel said about the kind of the fluidity, there's a reconfiguration of governance, right? So it might look like disorder, but it's actually different actors, state authorities that overlap with armed groups, that might overlap with the authority of local leaders, of economic brokers. So this is constantly in flux. And that, of course, can resonate with what we're seeing in the world today, right? Where we might no longer only have states as the only actors, and we might no longer have certain state actors kind of being at the forefront. We see a shift, and I would say it's a slow shift that has been going on for a long time. But just in the way in which at the local level, in border areas, we need to factor in other actors. The same way at the global level, private companies are important. Even individuals have become more important when we think about politics. And that's how this mix of different types of actors who shape governance, I think, are important. But then I would also say that if we use this borderland lens, we can see kind of as a magnifying glass on society, we can see how globalization, if I can still use that term, because even that is contested, but how globalization and insecurity coexist, right? And in Borderlands, that's very much manifested by the fact that licit, informal, and illicit flows move through the same corridors, right? So it can be drug trafficking, human trafficking, but it can also just be contraband. At the same time, it's also legal goods that are moving there. And all these different flows are taking advantage of the increased connections that we see at the global level. And then, of course, also technological change, right? We know how mobile payments, encrypted communication have made cross-border networks faster, more adaptive, and also harder to regulate. Again, that's something that is manifested at the global level in how we understand global security, but it has this very local impact as well in terms of how order is negotiated locally and how, if we call it fragmentation, but I think you need to be cautious there, how it's also relevant at the local level. So just to add some kind of examples here, I mean, in our project that is supported by Accept, we look at border regions of Colombia, of Iraq, of Somalia, and in those regions, we see how different actors and different groups, they regulate trade, they regulate mobility, and they also impose their own governance rules, right? So it's not just the state imposing them. And these very rules, they influence the global supply chains, again, for example, of drugs or weapons that they're part of. And those in return are shaped by global affairs. Because of course, if we traffic, for example, weapons, we need to ask ourselves, who requests those weapons? Who demands those weapons? Where are those conflicts? And we have seen shifts by events that affected global security, such as the Russian invasion in Ukraine, for example, but also more regionally, if we think about conflicts in Yemen, or even the tensions between the United States and Venezuela, where that has affected very much the local level. So in a way, we need to think about these different levels, right? And understand how these different if you want, actors of governance are operating and how authority is being renegotiated in border areas. And I think this is one way of looking at the global level and understanding how global security also has these multiple layers of authority, if you want, that are constantly in flux. And maybe I leave it just here for now.
Yeah, a super important dimension to add to this. So before we go further to this, down to the empirical level of your research, maybe just to stay with one conceptual point on the definition of order. So I was thinking of a more traditional definition to just throw in there, which would perhaps be a stable distribution of power and a widely recognized set of rules and norms in a given region that is enforced by a central authority. I think that is usually the typical definition of order, but you probably will disagree. But I wonder sort of then how we should make sense of order in a different way, and also what replaces centralized authority. Annette already lent some insights there, but I wonder, Daniel, if you maybe want to speak on that and also maybe relate to your research on terrorism.
Oh, absolutely. You asked the question about what replaces central authority. It assumes that central authority is the default. And so, again, it's the language of spectacularity that evokes panic when that is now eroding. But for decades and centuries, you have predominantly Muslim regions in Africa where the default was never really a central authority. And so when you're dealing with that starting point of a central authority, you fall into a sort of Max Weber's sort of demarcation of state society that doesn't apply in a context where the state itself was negotiated, was never really one thing. So how do you make sense of that when the very concept of order lands in a nonsensical way in this region? So I think that's the very subversive approach that we have to take and recognize and really see what is going on in these spaces. And so I think we need to question the default to order as being something that is positive and good, and then it's then marketed to other parts of the world, because that itself doesn't even hold in context where order itself. What is order in American history? When you peel open the historical complexities of that region. So I think we need to move beyond the language of order or disorder, because itself, it applies a certain kind of Manichaean dualism of good, evil, what is better, what is not, and precisely move into this sort of negotiated blood boundary of the state that we see. And in that context, then perhaps there's enough to learn from the so-called global south in this regard, where things are never really stable. And so the borderland logic is not really something that is particular to borderland communities. It's actually the law of the reality. And it's not just the reality of politics, it's the reality of the environment, the planetary more broadly, that things are not kind of centralized, that they are interdependent, they are constantly shape-shifting. And I think this is the kind of the logic, hopefully, we are coming to perhaps through the environmental side of things. But yet again, we need the language of disaster in order to wake us into this sort of interconnectedness that borderland regions are already familiar with, because, as I said, they leave fluidity. And so I think that's where our politics perhaps need to be rewired.
That's super interesting, and also speaks to the sort of opportunities that may also arise from these changes that we're seeing, both in terms of improving our understanding of world politics, but also to the lived realities on the ground, and that not everything is as doomsday as it might seem. As the Red Hot Chili Peppers said, destruction breeds creation. But before that, maybe Brian, maybe a point on legitimacy, sort of when you hear this from a moral philosophical perspective and so on, how should we make sense of legitimacy and political order under such conditions?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I think, Daniel, your skepticism towards the Weberian conception of legitimacy as a sort of perception and also mass endorsement-based conception of legitimacy, it really does highlight the fact that, what Weber aptly provided was a very parsimonious definition, and also a way of framing the way, citizens relate to the state. But what he omitted was the conditions under which such attitudes of assent are and were historically formulated. The kinds of entities we see as righteous, as just, as protectors, as opposed to arbitrary imposers, of their wills against us. It's a fine line. It is not the case you have clean-cut and clearly defined and delineated categories between legitimate and illegitimate, and something sort of ontologically distinct and independent about them. Very often this is sociologically constructed. And that is why, whilst I feel personally quite conflicted about this question, because on one hand, as an analytical political philosopher, I sort of work, John, largely on setting out clear criteria for legitimacy. And there I've come up with a new tripartite framework that says legitimacy can be achieved, not just through a Weberian sense with some idealized conditions attached to it, but also if there's a delivery of key and substantive outcomes that everyone in a polity agreed to be at least minimally of a degree of minimal importance, right? So there's an overlapping consensus of goods, and whoever instrumentally delivers that, you can call that a state that's outcome legitimate, whereas a state that meets the criteria that Weber outlines would be perceived to be legitimate and thus satisfy the conditions for perceptual legitimacy. And then on top of that, you've also got procedural legitimacy as a third prong, right? Where you want your leaders to be held accountable, and where there's a reliable mechanism that translates the preferences and wills of citizens into policy outputs in a kind of manner that, for instance, Kant and subsequently more recently Annie Stiltz write of, right, when they look at authorization literature, for instance. And a curiosity here is, even through just purely an analytic philosophical lens, you would note that outcome legitimacy, procedural legitimacy, and also perceived or perceptual legitimacy, they can come together empirically, but they often come apart. So you might have governments that are procedurally legitimate, where they adhere to all and every single rule in a constitution and then some, and where decisions are democratically determined, and yet you don't get the kinds of outcomes you want to see. So some folks might label these states weak democracies or dysfunctional democracies, or some others might say it's 2026 America, although I'm a bit more optimistic about the Big Apple and also the states at large than that. Whereas on the other hand, you might also have states that deliver steadily and consistently, at least for protracted periods of time, a wide range of outcomes: economic growth, some modicum of redistribution, national pride, whatever you take to be core goods that incontrovertibly good and desirable, at least in the eyes of the majority of people. And yet you might not see democratic institutions or mass participation in politics in these states, right? And of course, I'm referring here to enduring authoritarian states that are able to, make claim or construct claims of legitimacy through appealing to not so much procedures, not so much the sort of openness of the systems, but the outcomes they deliver. So in practice, we're left with this pretty confusing mixture, even if we're just taking this through a purely analytic lens, right? Setting aside history, setting aside the future, setting aside the historicity as to who got to construct these definitions, even within this very narrow framework. We've got disputes over which of these, if any, is a sufficient conception of legitimacy, or is none amongst these three ways of approaching legitimacy in fact sufficient? Are they jointly necessary? Are they jointly sufficient? What exactly is the point of this exercise of interrogating legitimacy? And that is when we then open up an entire can of worms, but I would say good worms, like wormholes, right? That shed light on the fact that legitimacy as a discourse, justification as a narrative or description, or even democracy as an essentially contested concept to some extent, or a semi-essentially contested concept. All of these are terms that are appropriated by political powers and figures to serve their own ends, to keep themselves in power, to domesticate the populations, to convince them that they have the right to rule, whatever the right actually means in practice. And when not folks actually think through lenses of normative argumentation, that's an aside. So I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to your question, except the fragmentation you highlighted there, in your first question, it applies. It extends all the way down. We're now living in an era where definitions are increasingly fragmented, and where the seemingly sort of uncontested and also, almost dogmatically true nature of these words, well, we're seeing a problematization of them and then a reappropriation of them. And what we're then ending up with is essentially contests over meanings and contests over the contours of definitions, which in turn underpin and reflect, power struggles in a much broader and wider sense. So I guess that's my answer to your question.
John, if I may just quickly flesh out one aspect of what Brian is saying there, to just say that we're talking about the sources of legitimacy here. I'm working with returning repentant from the Lake Chad Basin. And what we're hearing from the community is that it's not enough for them to have gone through the official DDR, demobilization, disarmament, reintegration, that it matters for them that if the repentant actually in a public doing of community put their hand before the Quran and swear that they won't do it, that has more authority than anything. And again, we hear that. So how do you understand legitimacy when you're going via the state, when the community is actually saying, what will actually convince us that this person has repented is that they put their hand in the public square and they swear before the Quran. So you see how it depends on what sources of legitimacy we are drawing on. And I just wanted to make that intervention as well.
Yeah, that's a super interesting intervention. And let's sort of bring it back from this more conceptual philosophical debate to, again, the realities on the ground. Our proposition is that borderlands are central rather than peripheral to global order. And I think what's happening in Latin America at the moment, Annette, is very much where this sort of manifests itself strongly today. So I wonder what you recently observed in Latin America with sort of in relation to sort of how governance is shaped there. And you may tie it back to this question of sort of how actors legitimize themselves, but also you might talk about sort of how these illicit flows scale up then to regional or global politics in terms of more of the power dynamics there.
Right. Thanks so much. But first of all, just adding also a small point about the legitimacy. I think we also see this in terms of how, and tying it to that question, how these different types of actors in border areas, but also beyond, how they are governing, right? Because they are often perceived to be legitimate authorities, if you want, by the local population, because they deliver, because they provide services, because they are there where the state is not. I mean, the whole literature on rebel governance shows that as well. So even that kind of how perceptions of legitimacy vary, I think is really important, and also show us that we need to really take different perspectives depending on what level of analysis we're also looking at. So going back to kind of how we can link kind of what's happening at this very local level to then scale up and the global level is, I mean, first of all, it works both ways, right? So you asked me about Latin America, and I mentioned before kind of the tensions between the US and Venezuela. So if we consider what happened in January, right, the US attack on Venezuela, well, of course, that first of all, it was in violation of the UN Charter, or what some may call the so-called rules-based international order. Well, it had an impact internationally, but of course it also had an immediate impact on the Venezuelan-Colombian border. I mean, the trade dynamics there, how armed actors in Venezuela, for example, moved closer to the border, including the Colombian rebel group ELN. They were on Venezuelan soil, right? And how border areas provide this opportunity of impunity because the groups can simply go back and forth. But that's the lens that we normally have, right? We start global and then think about, okay, is there an impact on the local level? Now, what we are doing in the work here is also just flip this around, right? And say, actually, we can also start from the local level and see how this is relevant globally. And that's because border areas, they function as nodes in kind of connecting very local dynamics to global systems. And that's particularly the case through the illicit supply chain networks. So border areas, and we talk about this also more in a future session, they are where often these supply chains originate. We look at this, for example, in terms of the weapons that are smuggled through the borderlands in Iraq or in Somali Bosaso, the weapons that have been used in wider regions and conflicts, as I mentioned before, or then going back to Latin America, the cocaine that is smuggled across the Colombian-Venezuelan border, which then has triggered these international tensions that we see, for example, because of the US's overly militarized reaction. So it went both ways, right? It's on the one hand, the repercussions of the attack on what's happening locally, but also in the end, the origin is the smuggling locally, which then has also created tensions. But then there's also other connections, because more generally, these illicit supply chains, they, first of all, of course, they empower violent actors because they serve as an income source, right? And this is an income source for so-called terrorist groups, rebel groups that then might stage attacks elsewhere. Then secondly, they also influence regional power balances, because who gets to control certain trafficking corridors, for example, is the one who has more power in the region. And then ultimately, they also erode this state-based systems, because local livelihoods, they are often provided via illicit activities. But then going back to legitimacy, they are often considered legitimate, right? So if I don't have any alternative livelihoods, well, yeah, I might be involved in smuggling across the border. simply because that's what's on offer. But still, I want to make sure we don't look at these dynamics as something only negative and only kind of highlighting the illicit. Ultimately, all those dynamics, they also bring lots of opportunities, right? Cross-border economies can support livelihoods, they can support regional resilience, and that's why it's important to highlight kind of this dual nature of these dynamics. So therefore, when we link what's happening in border areas and global security more broadly, yes, we need to pinpoint and understand how it might kind of at these local levels, how they might kind of promote these global threats to some extent as well. But at the same time, we also need to ask ourselves why that is the case. Is it maybe because we don't pay enough attention to border areas? And is it because we don't see from central areas where all the opportunities are and where kind of border areas also bring kind of livelihood opportunities for local people? So understanding kind of this dual nature is really important so that we can understand how what happens in Borderlands ultimately scales outward and can shape regional stability, not just instability, and can also help promote global security architectures.
Mm. Yeah, so maybe as a preliminary conclusion on our discussion of legitimacy, we might just say that it's fundamentally about service provision, but that in addition to that, there can be different kinds of constructivist repertoires that actors resort to in order to legitimize their actions. But in that is also interesting how liberal ideas have become quite dominant, right? When you look at Putin and others and how they still sort of frame their actions within sort of the confines of international law. Which I find interesting. But then what Daniel said, this doesn't have to be the case, right? It can also just be put your hand on the Quran, and that's quite different. So maybe if we sort of take this back to the macro level, I think it's hard to reject the idea that we do see a new level of geopolitical contestation, great power, rivalries, and so on. And I wonder how sort of the borderlands that you're studying in the different regions might shape that. So I'm thinking especially of Latin America and East Asia with you, Annette and Brian, but then also about what's happening in West Africa, where I know a lot less about. So I wonder who wants to go first and perhaps fill us in on how, maybe Brian, you almost raised your hand, on what you observe in terms of how local regional elements are shaping global power dynamics.
Well, thank you very much, John. I that was not a hand raise, but I've now been volunteered as tribute. So I spent a lot of time traveling to and fro Southeast Asia and China, and I'd like to therefore frame my empirical observations around these two clusters of focus. And the first observation concerns Myanmar, which of course is a country of over 60 odd million people undergoing an incredibly difficult time right now with an ongoing civil war and strife. And it's worth noting that the sort of self-proclaimed government, positioned as legitimate government and military junta Tamadao in Myanmar controls only approximately 21 to 22% of the country's territory. Then you've got the rest of the territory evenly split amongst around 6 to 7 main rebel armies and militias, as well as, of course, areas to which no one actually lays claim in terms of providing governance or providing the kind of services that you talked about, and that both Annette and Daniel were hinting towards, right? We're not seeing that happening in the status quo. So what we're really witnessing in Myanmar today is not just a state of political fragmentation and fracturing, but also where borderlands are increasingly appropriated and utilized by adjacent and neighboring countries to advance their own security interests, right? And Operation 1023, that was basically a prime example, right, of a security-oriented and framed operation backed by and in fact driven by Chinese forces when it came to rooting out cyber scamming operations and criminal activities in a Kokang area. Some folks saw this as China seeking to entrench its influence. Others saw it as a warning and a warning shot that China was issuing to many of the militias, but also the junta, in a Naypyidaw, concerning the fact that Myanmar is seen as a part of China's periphery. But the gist or the takeaway from this episode is when borders are porous and borders are left unguarded, unsecured, or indeed, when they regress into disputed territories with no clear arbitrators, it is the people and ordinary civilians who suffer. That seems to be a pretty clear and stark example from the region. But we then contrast that with a slightly different set of examples from other ASEAN states. So whether it be in Vietnam, for instance, where you've got around at least 2 to 3 industrial zones clustered in the south, 1 or 2 major industrial zones in the north. These are positioned as special economic zones that are low tax, if not tax-free, and that they are increasingly run in accordance with jurisdictional laws, right, that are distinct from the remainder or the other parts of Vietnam per se. They've got their own legal jurisdictions and also, systems of mediation, arbitration, and legal dispute resolution. The similar observations being made of Iskandar in Malaysia, or the variety of special economic zones in Thailand and Tak and Songkhla, for instance. And I'm currently in Bangkok, so I just thought it'd be useful to situate, this conversation we're having about SEZs in the broader context that many of these countries are eager to pull in external investment, technologies, joint partnerships, joint ventures, and in their eyes, in the eyes of the government, they're willing to cede legal and jurisdictional authority over these zones. They're not on the physical border, but are certainly on the legal borders. They're quasi-liminal to some extent, right? As modeled after the SEZs that were introduced in China in the 1970s and 80s. They're quasi-liminal and lie beyond, right, the legal core and the sort of primary, jurisdiction of these respective countries. And there we see the porousness of these borders as something that's leveraged by, state authorities, of course, not just to advance economic objectives or institutional gains, but also to signal that there's a degree of political and institutional flexibility on offer here. So the takeaway from this is, I think, borderlands need not be, sites of contestation and struggle and conflict. They could also be intentionally created as effective breathing valves that allow for institutional differentiation between, what's going on within these SEZ parameters or boundaries and what goes on outside these particular and designated zones per se. And this then feeds back to the final point I'd make on Southeast Asia, that none of this concerning, the fact that we've got porous authority or multiple jurisdictional authorities governing the same spaces, none of this is new. The Mandela system that was introduced, in the early historical era or the early medieval period of Southeast Asia saw essentially a series of centers of power distributed across continental and maritime Southeast Asia. So you had, for instance, the Champa, the Angkor, which is, in correspondence with, say, the Angkor Wat today, or the Khmer sort of kingdom, and you've got Majapahit lower down, on the Indonesian islands. These are all power centers, or were power centers, that govern not by delineating clear borders and saying, this is my land, that's your land, when to do what Rousseau said men did, thousands of years ago in the origins of inequalities. Instead, what these power centers agreed to do tacitly was to allow for the cities and the settlements and the villages that were along the sort of rough regions of convergence between them to deal with both sides and to gain and derive benefits from essentially dealing with more than one single power center, to leverage and play off these power centers against one another implicitly. And that kind of agency is why ASEAN is such a fascinating region by and large. And it's worth exploring it, not just for negative examples of borderlands that have been corrupted, but also for more positive models of agency, leveraging borderlands, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a very interesting insight, the idea that even in an age of renewed or heightened global power competition, borderlands don't necessarily have to be zero-sum issues or black and white sort of contestations, but they can actually also play a constructive role in how global powers relate to each other. I wonder, Daniel, if you may want to come in on sort of how global power politics is shaped by local dynamics in West Africa.
Yes, absolutely. So to complement what Brian is saying there, these days I've been thinking a lot about borderlands beyond the more sort of traditional, sort of tangible material spaces or as flows, as Annette was saying. Maybe opening up that magnifying glass that Annette mentioned a little bit more to think about empire and to think about the politics of knowledge production. And each time I think about the borderlands, something about me tells me not to stay with them, but to be a bit more porous. Again, to use my promiscuous agency to expand it a little bit bigger, to see the ways in which borderlands themselves is what we categorize as the global south. And it's precisely because they are unknown, unknowable, that there is an effort and an attention to them, but they are also asserting their right to not be known in a way that the global order wants them to be known. So in a sense, it's in borderland spaces, metaphorically, that we see the unequal politics between the global north and the global south play out. And that politics often plays out within the context of knowledge production and the politics of knowledge, and and the effort by these countries to assert their right to agency, to assert their right not to be known in a certain kind of way. So I think Borderland reflects this sort of ambiguous this sort of history of taming or attempt to tame spaces that are not known. And you see that especially in how the language that has always characterized Africa maps neatly onto borderlands. Shadow, the shadow state, the dark continent, the jungle. I mean, close your eyes and all of these can be a synonym for the borderlands. So what are all of these things telling us? They're telling us that in borderland, we can actually situate the global politics about decolonization, about empire. We can borderland can move beyond, can even go a little bit more further analytically than we currently have. And when we do that, I think its potential become even more clear.
Thank you, Daniel. I think we move to the Q&A from here on. Feel free to put your questions in the chat on the topics we talked about, or anything that you might find interesting with regards to the areas that our speakers are studying. While we're getting the first questions, maybe Annette, your insights on what we're seeing in Latin America at the moment, in Mexico and Venezuela and so on. How does that scale up, perhaps, to questions of global order? And in the meantime, I'll take questions here in the chat or at the Q&A button.
Right. Well, I mean, what we're seeing, what I said before, how different armed groups are taking advantage of kind of this cross-border movement, right? So the Colombia-Venezuela border that was mentioned before, where right now it is, on the one hand, the Colombian conflict, on the other hand, there's still a crisis in Venezuela. We still have uncertainty in terms of how things will evolve. Now, let's just go one step back and understand kind of why we have the situation that these groups can move back and forth. Well, we need to go back to colonialism, right? Because in many parts of the world, including the border between Colombia and Venezuela, but also Myanmar. I mean, if you think about what Brian mentioned before, if we look at Shan State, for example, these are all artificial border lines, right? They have been imposed in Africa, of course, also. It's clear that these are imposed due to colonialism. It's not the borders that have kind of emerged naturally. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that we still have lots of communities that cross the border simply because that's where they have been living, right? It's not that they would then change. But it also means that this is then where we often see a confluence of, first of all, weak state governance, because central governments have invested less in those areas. Secondly, we often see kind of a proneness to impunity, because both sides of the border, they are often not really coordinating as well as they could in terms of security and justice. And then thirdly, those areas then become an environment with kind of low risks and high opportunities, partly because of the porosity. So in that sense, if you want, it's a homemade problem, right? Or something that has emerged before we are looking at borderlands the way we're looking right now. And this is why we have kind of the result. Now, what does that then mean at the global level? I think, again, it's about changing the narrative as well. And I agree with Daniel in terms of how borderlands are almost used to kind of symbolize all this darkness, or the kind of the ungovernance. People are talking about ungoverned spaces, and borderlands are often cited. They're not. We've already established that before, right? They're just different types of governance. They're different types of authorities. The challenge right now that we have is how we can change that into something more productive, right? And how we can make sure that we're using borderlands in a way that they could be, which is thriving areas for commerce, for investment, that can actually stabilize global order rather than leading partly through kind of to this destabilization. And again, if we think about what's happening also just recently now in Mexico, where the focus now is on violence in the country, again, we need to think about what happened in the first place, how drugs were trafficked across the borders from South America via Mexico into the United States because of the demand there. And then the other way around, how weapons have been trafficked also from the United States into Mexico. And again, it's the borderlands that are seen just as this negative site that facilitate that. But ultimately, it's further in the central areas, in the heartlands, if you want, where ultimately these decisions have been taken. So if we start really from the outside, if we start from the border areas, I think we can understand how the agency there can leverage kind of the positive results that we can get by simply flipping that around and make sure that we're not just perpetuating this narrative that has been there for a long time.
Thank you, Annette. So we have a question in the chat, and that is on the security development nexus, which I also have been thinking about. The question by Niels is, how strong is the effect on these negative borderland dynamics on geopolitical trends and development? So what we've recently seen is that the US, but also European countries, have massively cut development aid and moved it very much these funds to, again, more traditional investments in arms development. And of course, a lot of development work is also about security sector reform and so on. And I was wondering whether sort of how that issue relates to global order and borderlands and how they matter for global security. I thought that's not what I was wondering. That's, I think, how I understand the question from Niels. Yeah. If anybody wants to come in. Maybe Daniel, on sort of the relationship between sort of development work and what happens in borderlands and how that matters for security on a larger scale.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think I had started off by mentioning that people have, the borderland is not just a space, it reflects people's identity and how they approach, how they navigate life. And so, which means they keep their options open. So when aid was cut, of course, the narrative we're getting from the Lake Chad Basin in Cameroon, in Niger, is Chad, is that you can see the visible effect. You can see hotels that are no longer occupied. You can see unfinished projects. But the language of people dying and death has to be nuanced much more than it is put out there, because it cripples the agency of these borderland areas that have always existed with or without foreign aid. So I think it has to do with taming the hubris of development aid and recognizing that life continues one way or the other. And people have always structured their lives to benefit, to keep the options open. So that includes working with NGOs when they're there, and when they're not there, turning to other infrastructures that can support them in times of need. And so that kind of self-sustainability of borderland areas is something that is really intriguing and that we can borrow from as maybe an epistemological intervention that can shape how we think about development, how we think about the state, but also how we think about things like the politics of immigration today. Today, we are having ICE walking in the streets, apprehending people. We're having walls being built. What does the borderland have to tell us about these kinds of practices in the ways in which they have always navigated these difficulties, these identities, and continue to exist? So it's not like one borderland has been eliminated and now we have to move into the next frontier of borderland. It morphs, it changes, it remains. And I think there's that kind of stamina of borderland areas that we need to allow that stamina to breathe into the kind of static narrative that is so too often out there. And also to say that all of this is not to deny, John, the fact that there is a global order. And so this is not, and the people there are not naive to say, listen, it's all about what happens here. They know, they feel the effect of US strike when Trump decided that Christians were being harassed in Nigeria and decided to strike Nigeria recently. They felt the effect. So there is a real material effect of this global order. But it's just to say that that's not the end point. That's not the end point. And so they keep the option open. They make claims to this order when it matters. Historically, they've always done that. But at the same time, everything cannot be reduced to that particular order. And I think that's the point I think I hear us trying to make here, that it's an order that is more of a relational order rather than one that is one or the other.
Okay, let's take two more questions and hope that we won't run more than 3-4 minutes over time. So there are actually two similar questions in the chat, one by Ruth and one by Raphael, and they are sort of on the adaptation of groups on the ground and also globalization dynamics. Do they respond to global trends, and how do also changes in global trade regimes affect sort of how local groups, communities, and so on act in Borderlands? That's how I understand the two questions from Ruth and Raphael.
Maybe I can just come in here. So first of all, I think the first question was also more kind of about the criminal groups there, and they are very resourceful. And I think one problem often is that we're also just underestimating them, kind of just considering them very localized actors who are not kind of embedded in this global order that we were talking about. But actually, in fact, we are seeing how they're very much taking advantage of what's happening at the global level. So, for example, during COVID, when borders were closed, yes, it did disrupt certain illicit supply chains, but at the same time, we've also seen how quickly different groups adapted and were able to use kind of loopholes and were able to cross borders in certain areas where it wasn't possible before, and just understand how governments kind of anticipate how governments might react. Same if we think about, again, the US action in Venezuela. The ELN in Colombia, they staged an armed strike in protest to the US military action. So they were very aware of what was happening. And then in terms of understanding kind of how it's linked to free trade, and I would even argue the kind of the process of globalization more broadly. Earlier, I mentioned the role of technology and understanding how criminal activities, how illicit supply chains have benefited from enhanced communication technology. I mean, starting first with the internet, but then also now with AI and different kind of technological tools that exist in order to, first of all, conceal trafficking, but also at the same time just broaden it and making it kind of really a globally networked business rather than just staying within regions. I think this is important. And even simple things, if we think about, for example, one example is how a bridge was built between Colombia and Ecuador, and that was to enhance the trade. It was supposed to benefit the local people. Well, of course, it also benefited those who then wanted to traffic trucks across the border. So there is really always this kind of this dual meaning here, where first of all, we shouldn't underestimate how these criminal actors are aware of what's happening in the world, but also how they're using that and how they're often one step ahead. Partly because often they follow a network structure, whereas governments, they are organized hierarchically. It's much harder to kind of keep up with those developments. So yes, that doesn't mean, of course, we should stop kind of these developments in terms of technology, and we should kind of consider then free trade as just having this negative side effect. But we do need to be better aware in terms of how it's being used or abused from time as well.
Yeah, I think that sort of brings us full circle. Maybe just for brief answers, maybe from Daniel and Brian briefly. I think one question was, again, sort of how people on the ground view these global trends, this sort of global historical moment, if you want to call it that, or developments. So, Brian, you've traveled a lot around East Asia, and Daniel, you've done ethnographies on the ground. Maybe if we sort of just a few insights on sort of interesting developments that you see there. Maybe Brian first.
Action begets reaction. Regulation entails circumvention. And above all, bifurcation gives rise to flexibility and also attempts to maneuver between all sides. That's really just hopefully a pithy summary of my experiences on the ground in Southeast Asia, where Malaysia, Vietnam, and previously Singapore had become some of the most prominent sites of re-exporting of Chinese manufactured goods, but also of US manufactured advanced chips, specifically Hopper chips, over which, of course, we've seen State and Commerce, over recent weeks put out very fervent statements denying the successful rerouting of these chips or illicit flows, so to speak, into China. It's funny because it used to be that State would emphasize the existence of these illicit flows and call for crackdown upon them. But now we've seen a 180 in recent weeks where essentially the argument or narrative is, no, none of these chips are going to China. This is all just, somehow a publicity stunt. But clearly the reality lies somewhere in the middle. And it's the porousness of these economies we're looking at here in ASEAN, in a refusal to take sides or to court all sides. That's how we've come to see essentially the potency of not even necessarily middle powers, but just regionally potent powers or nodules in global supply chains that are willing to and able to leverage their relative flexibility and porousness in order to maximize their own national economic and strategic interests. That's my answer.
Thanks. That's on the global supply chains. And maybe Daniel, finally, on the question of sort of how actors on the ground view these developments.
Yeah, so I think on the ground, actors are very much aware of what is going on. They stay connected to the news, even in Boko Haram camp in Sambisa Forest, where people always describe as insurgent hideout. We are getting interviews now with folks that are coming out telling us they have transistor radios, they are listening to what is going on, they are looking at the AIDS discussion, and we see that play out as well in this insurgent language as well, where they are very sharp, they are understanding the shift in discourse at the global level and then trying to position themselves. So I think what we need to think about is to think about people who navigate these borderland zones as tactical and strategic agents as well. Too often we deny them of that kind of active agency to move, to know. And this is why I said we need to also think about the politics of knowledge, and that these are not just dark spaces. These are spaces that are quite set up to, they're used to constantly shifting. And so which means you need to know and keep ahead of the knowledge in order to know how to position yourself. If anything, the people who need to move a little bit more are the academics themselves, because the knowledge that is produced by this borderland are too often ahead of the knowledge we produce. We're still citing theories from the back, and they have already. So I'm going on the ground and they are telling me new developments that are happening and telling me, go and Google it. Google it, it's happening. And so a lot of these times, I think what I begin to see is the kind of the sharp knowledge that they have of what is going on, but also how they can manufacture this knowledge as well. So when we talk about knowledge, we're not assuming fact. We're not saying, oh, this is said, and so we need to fact check. That's not their word. Their word is how can we manipulate this knowledge to advantage. So in that sense, then it's various forms of distortion, assuming that there is no single knowledge that shapes this field. And this is how they themselves live and survive and go. So I think that's what I'm discovering, that is the politics of unknowledge, where the knowledge is actually against this sort of hegemonic knowledge of fact. In fact, it's this blurring of this knowledge and manipulation all the time, trying to cut an advantage for themselves. But this is what you do in places that mobility is key to survival. You need to hustle.
That's a super interesting sort of final comment. The idea that we have to get out and get our boots dirty and talk to people on the ground to make sense of what's going on, because it is so unique. And very often we find that research on this is too top down and not empirical sometimes enough. So before we end, maybe just a quick question to you. If you could name one resource that speaks to what we've talked about today, either a podcast, a book, or a film, a documentary, anything, and maybe just say one or two sentences about why it might be interesting to our listeners. Maybe Annette, if you go first.
Right. Well, I'm going to be cheeky and I will recommend the website of the ACCEPT program, because this is where there's really lots of useful resources. I mean, that's where our project is part of, but other work, Daniel's work as well. And there's lots of resources in terms of understanding different types of border areas, really globally, where we have insights from people on the ground. But at the same time, there's also work that then connects that to the global level and shows kind of why we need to care about this connection and those links. Thank you.
Great. Who wants to go next?
I'm happy to. I'd recommend a book by David van Reybrouck called Revolutie, Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World. A really, really interesting ethnographically and also oral testimony informed historical account of, Indonesia's struggle, the struggles of the Indonesian peoples all the way through from the origins of, the sort of civilizations that predated, of course, modern Indonesia, through to the moment when Indonesia, with the revolutionary leaders, Suharto, Hatta, declared independence, and then subsequent negotiations and navigations of power. Why is this relevant? Well, I think Indonesia is itself a fascinating metaphorical borderland, right? Given its straddling and having comprised such a rich plurality of kingdoms, of civilizations, and also, of course, it's being a part of the Dutch East Indies and the Dutch Empire and colonial project at large, and the sort of anti-colonial resistance and struggle. So all in all, a fascinating read, and hopefully could shed light on borderlands beyond physical borders as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think for me, the book I would recommend, I should say that I have a book on mobility, mobilization, and counterinsurgency. And what it does is that it takes mobility as a key lens for understanding not just what is going on materially, but also for begin to reconfigure our epistemological assumptions. And I think that's so important. And I think scholars have not quite latched onto the fact that a lot of, and Brian, you talked about how a lot of what we see is shaped by language itself. And so when we just assume, for example, order, what does that mean? I mean, what is order in Hausa? What is order in Mandarin? And how does that play out? So we need to begin to reconfigure, and that involves us as educators, how we put together our curriculum, and how we begin to challenge some of these quite entrenched viewpoints that, in a way, if we see them long enough, we begin to think that's how the world is. So there's a certain kind of deceptivity I recommend in my book that mobility allows us precisely to see, because it's a site of contradiction.
Thank you, Daniel. That's great. So we'll add all of these resources to our list that we will compile for all webinars. I think we've had a fascinating discussion today. I learned a lot on the fragmentation or not fragmentation of global order, authority beyond the state, but also how we go from the margins to global order with some really interesting conceptual insights. Next week, we have another webinar, same time, 1 o'clock on Wednesday, and it will be on remote sensing for conflict analysis and security governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.